Good evening, everyone. My name is Kathleen Olive. I'll shortly introduce the person I'm speaking with tonight. That's Dr. Mindy MacLeod. But first, I'll start with an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Limelight Arts Travel acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and to be chatting with Dr. Mindy MacLeod. Mindy, thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for asking me, Kathleen.
So, Mindy, I just wanted to say a few words about you and about your expertise before we start chatting. So, you are a lecturer, you're an academic author and translator and academic editor as well, who specializes in the language and literatures of the Scandinavian world. And maybe in a moment we can get into a little bit about what took you down that path, what led you to your research specialization. But in terms of where you've studied and worked and carried out your research, that's also been squarely in the Scandinavian world as well, because you have a PhD from the University of Uppsala in Sweden. You taught there and you also taught at Linnaeus University, also in Sweden. And in Australia, you've taught and carried out your research at the University of Melbourne, the University of Queensland, and also at Deakin University. So we're very pleased to be able to access your expertise this evening in talking about the Scandinavian world. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Mindy, I imagine that there are people who are joining us tonight and who are going to listen to the recording later who, when they think of the language and literatures of the Scandinavian world and when they think of your particular expertise, which is runic writing and runic literacy, their mind, I imagine, starts wandering, as mine does, to kind of old saga texts that we were taught at university as part of my English literature degree. So what was it that took you down that road?
I've always been interested in languages, so I've studied quite a number of languages. But at university, I was really interested in German and Swedish, and it was hard to access the older forms of language. I studied at Melbourne University, and you could study Old Norse on and off then. You can't now, unfortunately. But you couldn't really get an understanding of the breadth of the literature. So I was interested in that, and it was all pre-Google, information being readily available. So I ended up going over to Sweden, I think about my master's year, and studying at Uppsala, which is one of the oldest universities over there. And there you could study things like place names and runic inscriptions and things that just, at the time were not widely accessible in Australia. It was just hard to know what was out there and what it meant. And it's really interesting, that kind of thing. So I studied a couple of courses for my master's and ended up going back for my PhD and looking at the runic inscriptions of Scandinavia, of which there are so many. There are thousands of these things. So to your average Scandinavian, they're just something that they'll see, depending on where they live. It might be on a daily basis. It might be on but it's a kind of everyday phenomenon. But still for Australians, that kind of really, really old textual information is it carries a huge significance. And there's also, and even then, and even more now, there's a lot of misinformation associated with things like runic inscriptions, where they're used as kind of fortune-telling devices and stuff. So it's a matter of unpicking what they actually say and what they actually can tell us and what they actually can't. And all of that information is really important because it's been used and abused. If you look at the use of runes by the Nazi Party in the Second World War, it's important to know what they do say and what they don't. And so that's something that was really interesting to me. And when I was studying in 80s and 90s, much less readily available to, it was much harder to access that kind of information. It was information I wanted to have. I wanted to know what was out there. And, your average Viking Age runic inscription is incredibly beautiful. So it exists as a work of art, but then you want to know what it can say. And your average Swede or Norwegian can't tell you what it says. So it's interesting to be able to know what those things are telling us.
What kind of arc of time does the whole script and the literature that you've studied, what's the arc of time that it covers? When was the language really vibrant and in use?
What I'm interested in are Viking Age runic inscriptions, which are those sort of, typical ones with, swirling animals and swirling devices and inscriptions, usually memorial inscriptions. And that's, from about the 900s to the 1200s. But runic writing as a script existed from perhaps about 100 AD right up to the early 20th century in certain parts of Scandinavia. So it has been a living script for a long time, but it's divided into various periods. So you've got the early period where you've got these more enigmatic texts where often you might know what they say, but you don't really know the significance of what that is. And then the thousands of Viking Age texts, which tend to be memorials to dead kinsmen, but also say other things too. Then into the post-medieval period where in a place like Bergen in Norway, you've got runes being used as a kind of everyday script beside the more ecclesiastical use of Latin for church affairs and things. But then, in certain remote outposts of Scandinavia, runes continued in use. They were the everyday script of people. So they cover such a broad field, yeah.
Yeah, I think we all think about how far and wide the Vikings traveled and how their influence spread. But sometimes it is those kind of inscriptions that bring you back to the reality that I remember years ago being struck by a stone lion in Venice that the Venetians had, ripped off from the Eastern Mediterranean. And at some point in its history, that lion had been in Istanbul, where some bored Viking guards had carved an inscription
Oh, at
into
the
it.
arsenal. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, exactly.
A
And so,
really long inscription.
okay,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well, I
Mhm.
mean, obviously, I can't read it. So you had this period in which you studied and traced runic writing, and one of your areas of expertise is runic literacy. What did your
Mhm.
studies take you to look at there?
So I was looking at the sort of nuts and bolts of runic writing, the kind of conventions they use, the abbreviations, and that kind of thing. There's all kinds of things you can study. You can study it from a semantic perspective. What kind of words are they using, and what do those mean in that context? Or you can look at the letters they're using, or you can look at the increasing correspondence to the Roman alphabet. But my thesis was essentially on runic ligatures, on the use of particular contractions within the scripts. But then my second book was written with a colleague of mine here in Australia, so it's not unheard of to be interested in runes in Australia, and we developed an interest in the use of runes used in amulets. So not runes as magic per se, but obviously you can use runes for anything. You can write a love letter, you can write, an epitaph, you can write whatever you want in it. But the use of runes in inscriptions, designed to be magic, addressed to pagan or Christian deities or saints and so on. We were looking at why the runic script in particular might have been used in those particular contexts. So, I mean, it lends itself to so many areas of study.
And it was the runes I know that led to your interest in Orkney in particular as well. So when we were talking about this tour and putting this tour together, and we were talking to you about tours that kind of fell within your area of research interest,
Mhm.
out of great ignorance, I was initially surprised that Orkney and Shetland fell into that area, but then of course this was part of the Viking world. So could you tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
how the islands formed part of the Viking world?
Yeah, and Kathleen, you had a map that you said
Yeah.
you might like to share because I think it's important to remember that although these are now obviously Scottish islands, they were very much part of the Norse sphere of influence. You can see that if you're coming down to raid the coast of Ireland or England, then a stop off at Orkney or Shetland is a brilliant place to stop along the way. Or if you're going off to settle in Iceland, that's also a nice stop off along the way because but basically the North navigators, it's thought they like to hug the coastline as much as possible. So, that they would stop off at these places and then, the pattern we've seen in other places, just stopping off ultimately often leads to permanent settlement. And so, whether it was because they were brilliant as, a kind of, military base, or whether they just decided that actually they're about as, fertile for farming and stuff as areas of Norway or stuff, they just became a place where a lot of people ended up staying.
Mm. And they brought, I mean, I'm assuming as, good colonizers do, they brought their culture with them to the
Yeah.
islands, regardless of how far. I mean, on the map, you just think it's so tight. When I was looking for this map, I found one that was the world from the perspective of the Arctic Circle. And it kind of crunches down in a way that it's quite hard to conceive of because Orkney is so close to the tip of mainland Scotland. But as you say, if you're island jumping and coast hugging,
Yeah.
it's absolutely on the way. So they stayed, and they brought their culture there with them.
Yep. So they brought their language. So we had Scandinavian languages spoken on Orkney and Shetland for quite a number of time. Those languages have died out. So Norn, the languages of Orkney, Shetland, the Norse-based languages of Orkney and Shetland, although you still see, traces in the dialects. So a lot of dialectal words remain. And yes, they brought their culture. So they brought, obviously the idea of writing in runes, and the yeah. So the people in Orkney became quite powerful, and had to be taken into regard in relation to the rest of Europe because they made these places their power bases for a considerable time.
Mm. It's when we were putting this tour together and, looking at how to kind of group sites together and work through the itinerary, I was really struck by, and again, ignorance on my part because islands are usually melting pots, but I was really struck
Mhm.
by the different phases of culture on the islands, on
Yeah.
Orkney in particular. And so in the itinerary, we've tried to work our way through them. So obviously the tour doesn't start on the islands. You'll assemble with your group in Glasgow and then travel together to Kirkwall.
Yeah.
Kirkwall on Orkney is your base for 5 nights. So when you were thinking about that part of the itinerary, what kind of sites were on your absolute, must visit list and why?
So I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that Kirkwall didn't begin with the Vikings. So, yeah, sorry if I made it sound that way. But, there were Celts living there beforehand who have left a lot of evidence of their of what they were doing. There's some uncertainty as to what happened to them once the Vikings, or not the Vikings, once the Norse arrived in great numbers. But yeah, so it is a melting pot of, various civilizations. And so I think one of the great things about places like Orkney and Shetland is you can see, Neolithic sites dating back thousands of years. So if you go to somewhere like Maeshowe in Orkney, this is 5,000 years old. Obviously that predates any kind of Norse civilization and is fascinating in its own right. And you see things like, the standing stones of Steerness or the Ring of Brodgar, which are kind of like a mini Stonehenge or that kind of, Stone Age setting. But what you also find there is the Norse overlay. So in a place like Maeshowe, a really old, burial cairn, which is fabulous to visit in its own right. But then there's around 30 runic inscriptions scratched in it by later Norse invaders who obviously used it as a base for one or more of their expeditions and found it really useful and carved all kinds of crude, nasty, whatever, runic inscriptions on the wall. And you see the same kind of thing on things like the Ring of Brodgar. So this ring of standing stones, which has got a couple of runic inscriptions on them. And there you have the question, are they Viking Age or are they later? Because what we're finding on Orkney is runic inscriptions are popular. People have really, in Orkney and Shetland, people have really embraced the Norse heritage. So, it tends to be a very beloved thing. So what you find, unfortunately, really, are new runic inscriptions cropping up in prehistoric tombs. And if they're new and they've never been documented before, you can say, okay, well, that's a, 21st century copy. But if you've got something documented from the 19th century, there's much more of a question attached to it. Is this a genuine Norse inscription scratched on it, or is it a copy that no one really noticed until a much later time? And we're still at a stage where it's quite hard to date runic inscriptions, particularly short ones, So, if it looks like a copy of something in Maeshowe, maybe it is. But, maybe it's another person with that name turned up at the same time and scratched his name into a site. So I think, the overlay of older and newer and new again is quite interesting and is something you don't necessarily see in other places. It's very much a feature of Orkney in particular, perhaps because of the extent to which they've embraced their Norse heritage. So you see things like, runic lollies and, lots of runic-based T-shirts and stuff. And, there's there's a market for it, but there also appears to be a genuine love for, going back much more, I would say, than there is for the Celtic kind of overlay. Yeah. So, you will find more runic T-shirts than other ones. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, isn't it?
It is a bit, yeah, it's something I hadn't really thought of, but it is something that just seems to have been, maybe because the rest of Scotland can do Ogham, and this is something that is seen as, more unique to the islands. Yeah.
But if I've understood, you're saying that people are going to local people are going to places like Maeshowe. It seems to be that there's modern graffiti, let's call it runic graffiti, that's starting to appear at some of those much older sites.
Oh, not at Maeshowe, which is really well guarded, but at some of the other sites, yeah. Yeah, I don't think you'd get in there and with a penknife, Um, but yeah, in some of the other sites, yes, it is something that is being noted and is proving a problem because then, do you investigate?
Mm.
And I mean, like anywhere else, you also have there was a runic inscription in the Kirkwall Museum until very, very recently, until someone went in and said, "Oh, actually, I carved this 50 years ago," as a joke. Uh, at which point it was promptly removed. So, there is an appreciation of history which isn't always manifested in the best ways, perhaps. Yeah.
But it does seem, I'm jumping around here because as you're talking, my mind is kind of going off in lots of different directions. It does seem just from the imagery that in terms of site conservation, obviously places like Skara Brae, which we can talk about, and Maze House, some of those, part of that whole cluster of UNESCO World Heritage sites that are on
Mm-hmm.
Orkney in particular. Beyond those sites, it does seem that there is a lot of this ancient heritage from the
There's so
Neolithic sites
much.
right down to the Norse period, and then I don't know, beyond the 15th century when the islands then become part of a kind of a broader British history.
Mm-hmm.
It does feel like there are so many sites that some of them are just out in this extraordinary landscape. You just walk over to them and there they are. Is that the experience
Yeah.
of visiting them?
That is the experience I've had, and I think, yeah, when there are so many things, some of them are recorded. Yeah, something like Maze House is really revered,
Mm.
but some of the smaller tombs, and there are, really remarkable places. But yeah, you could just pop down there, and they're not under any kind of protection and things. And I mean, that's one of the beauties of the place, that you can turn up and look at it whenever you want, whenever suits you. And, I think as tourists, anyone is going to appreciate that. But obviously, the downside is you can spend a couple of nights in one, tomb carving. If you carve your name, people will know who you are. But if you carve it, depending on your level of learning and stuff, if you carve it in a particular way, it becomes much harder. Um, and and some of them are not as fully documented as you would like, of course. So then, it becomes hard to know, has this always been here or has it not? Yeah. But I mean, it is a landscape that is particularly rich in these kind of sites. Yes. And so, and that's one of the beauties of these kind of places. Yeah.
When we were working together on the itinerary, I noticed that there were a whole kind of raft of sites that you advocated for where we'll walk from the coach through, looking at, because you always try and look at the images of these places so that you get a sense of what the experience will be like through these amazing kind of remote and wild landscapes to these sites that
Mm-hmm.
look, to me at least, to be extraordinarily well preserved and less visited. And then on the flip side of that, there were some sites that looked to be, as you said, much better organized, much better protected. Some of them
Yeah.
have been, afforded kind of official levels of recognition and protection. And in those places, we worked quite hard to work around peak hours. So you're visiting Skara
Exactly.
Brae out
Yeah.
of hours,
Yeah.
for example. Skara Brae seems to be a place that everyone who goes to Orkney goes to Skara Brae. Can you tell us why?
I think you should. Yeah. I think it would be a shame to, it would be like, I can't think of a comparison, but yeah, it is a truly remarkable place. And like the first time I visited Orkney was as part of it was a symposium of runologists. So there were people who were really, really interested in runes, and some of them, their take was, "Oh, we're not really interested in Skara Brae because it's nothing to do with runes, It's much, much older. It's one of the,
Mm.
best preserved group of prehistoric houses in Europe. It's absolutely fabulous. So that was if you want to go there, you just go on your, free day before you go home. But I think it's hard to describe how overpowering this kind of place can be because it is remarkably well preserved, and that's because it was under cover for, it was sort of hidden. It was only exposed due to, and I'm not a geologist, so I don't know, soil erosion, sand erosion, that kind of thing. But it was sort of, it wasn't known about for most of its, for centuries. And then all of a sudden it came to light. And it's amazing, the fact that you can walk around the top of this essentially, prehistoric village and develop an instant appreciation without any prior knowledge whatsoever of how these kind of people were living, what their family setup was like, where they were sleeping in the house. It's something that there's very few places, that give you the opportunity to look at as intimately at, prehistoric people. And it's not just, a bit of wall or a bit of, something. It's actually houses with furniture, and it's absolutely amazing. So I think that, it should be, everyone's, if you have a kind of interest in history, it would be up there for everyone. And it's, even though, and I think the only reason it isn't is because it's in Orkney. It's harder to get to. You've got to go and get a, it's not one of the most accessible places. It's accessible once you're in Orkney. It's not hard to get to, but it's just that step further, and so it takes a little bit more effort. But certainly, if you were going to one place in Orkney, that's probably where I'd recommend you go, because it's absolutely fabulous, and you can see things a bit like Maze How, and you can see runic inscriptions elsewhere, but you can't see this kind of village type setup so well preserved anywhere else in Europe anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I was quite stunned when we were working on the itinerary, the kind of factoids that emerge, that sites are older than some of the religious, well, we assume they're religious, some of the sites with a spiritual significance on the island are older than other Neolithic sites, say in Malta, or the Neolithic village at Skara Brae is older than Neolithic villages that, people might know on Sardinia. And it is kind of
Mm-hmm.
amazing taking your mind back and going all the way back there. But then, as you say, the layers that come forward as well. So I
Mm-hmm.
remember reading about that site, that the manorial kind of baronial house is also still on the site from the when it was discovered and excavated. And it seems to me that Kirkwall, the actual town of Kirkwall, has some of those layers as well. Can you tell us a little bit
Mm-hmm.
about what Kirkwall is like as a town to visit?
Oh, look, Kirkwall's lovely as a town. I mean, it's not big, so it's, you can walk around it in, I guess, a day, and you'll get, your typical sort of what look like your typical British Isle shops and, village setup, as well as things like, the Earl's Palace and Kirkwall Cathedral is a magnificent building, which is perhaps unexpected. Again, in a place that most people are thinking of as, remote and relatively inaccessible, but that's a remarkable piece of architecture, and you can go up and do special tower tours and really take in the architecture of this place. And so it's not just a kind of, it doesn't have that provincial feel because it's still got impressive buildings or the ruins of impressive buildings like, something like the Earl's Palace. And then, Kirkwall is a place that really, it's very music-y. There's lots of pubs with people playing music and that kind of thing. So it's still a very, very living place, and there's plenty to do, plenty to go, plenty going on. You can visit whiskey distilleries. You can just visit a normal pub, and it's a very easy place to be in. It feels quite homey. Yeah.
I was thinking that the whiskey distilleries might help with the sense of liveliness.
perhaps, yeah. I mean, they have a beer in Orkney called what's it called? Skull Splitter, which is named after one of the Viking heroes. So, if you're going to enjoy yourself, it's a very easy place to enjoy yourself. It's easy to get around. I don't know what the public transport's like because you can just sort of walk, and it's all very accessible within it, but it doesn't feel compressed or anything. So it's I think it's a great place for a holiday. I mean, obviously, if you're in Orkney, you don't want to just stay in Kirkwall. You want to get out and see, more of the countryside. But yeah, it's a nice place to be. Yeah. Yeah,
I
yeah.
was glad that we were able to get whiskey distilleries, but also the brewery
Mm.
onto the itinerary so people can try both both tipples if they
I
so
think it's
desire.
important. Yeah, I think,
But
yeah, you need
you
when
mentioned
in
getting
Scotland,
out
yeah.
and about exactly it would be just criminal,
Mm.
wouldn't it? Not to have given some of the whiskey a try. But you mentioned getting out and about a bit, and so obviously you're in Kirkwall for 5 nights, which gives you the opportunity to
Mm.
visit some of the other islands, and you'll go to Scapa Flow, for example, and see the
Hmm.
Churchill barriers, and also the Italian chapel, and get that kind of window onto the more modern 20th
Yeah,
century history of the islands. But then, and I'm just keeping an eye on the time for us, but then your group moves to Shetland and you move
yeah,
over, you take the Northlink ferry overnight. If people are wondering about what that experience is, they're simple kind of cabins for one or well two bed cabins with ensuite bathrooms, and we've got a mix of inside and outside cabins on the ferry. You arrive in Lerwick on Scotland in the early morning, and you've got time to have a look around before you start your touring. But one of the things I was quite intrigued about that you included on the itinerary is something that I then noticed SBS had a documentary about at some point while we were working on the tour. I meant to tell you. And that is that you go to the local museum in Lerwick that looks at the Upeliar
hmm
celebration. Can you please tell us a little bit about that?
yeah. I've never been to Upeliar, and it is one of my ambitions. I would really like to go because it's one of those things that I don't think you can understand till you've been there. But Upeliar is a widely celebrated. It's a Viking festival. Well, so it's marketed as a Viking festival held every year in Lerwick and to a lesser extent in other places all over Shetland where they burn, the recreation of a Viking boat, and it's a real obvious celebration of their Viking heritage. What a lot of people don't understand is it's not, a direct tradition from the Viking age. There's never been a tradition of burning Viking boats for seasonal celebrations. But it is a sort of it's a celebration that I think it began in the 18th or 19th century where people wanted to celebrate their Viking heritage. So it's the same kind of thing we see to perhaps a lesser extent in Kirkwall where they're still selling, runic sweets and souvenirs. They really wanted to celebrate their Norse heritage. And so this whole festival was recreated, or was created because it had no actual predecessor, as a sort of celebration of Viking excess. So, it sort of starts off with a kind of ritual boat burning, but it's become such a huge thing where, only certain people from certain families have the right to participate properly, to a full extent. And it's a, hereditary kind of thing. And now a huge tourist attraction because people want to go and I think it did feature in an episode of Shetland. If you're a fan of the series Shetland by Anne Cleves, I think there was one episode focused on Upeliar. But yeah, so it's not, we don't have Viking festivals descended, that have actually passed through time to that. But it is such or it appears to be, as you can see at the museum, it appears to be such a, embracing of Norse culture, that again, like there is a real fondness for in places like Orkney and Shetland. Shetland has even less of or even fewer runic inscriptions and that kind of thing than Orkney does, but there's still in the language, well, in the dialect and in the culture, a really fondness for that kind of Norse past. So yeah, as manifested by Upeliar. So we're still working on that idea of having a
I was going to say
limelight tour.
yeah, you got some people in the office very excited about it.
Mhm.
We're always interested in adding winter tours because obviously this takes place at the end of January as a kind
January,
of a,
yeah,
end of the Yule period
yeah,
celebration. One of the things that has held us back so far from being in total agreement about it is not just the weather, but also how difficult it would be, I imagine, to secure accommodation
accommodation, yeah,
during something
yeah.
so popular. So essentially, the year before, there's like a festive master appointed from one of these families, and he has to oversee the construction of a
Of the
boat,
boat, yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
Viking boat, and the women work on the celebration side, on the party side, and then they burn that boat.
Yeah, I know. It's such a sad day for it to end. But I mean, obviously, a spectacular
Yeah.
kind of thing. And I mean, if you've watched any Viking movies at all, starting with the Kirk, what is it? I've forgotten his surname. But starting with the 1950s, the Vikings too, I think right up to the Norseman, there's inevitably some kind of boat burning. Uh, because it's hugely dramatic, So if you can do something like that, mm,
And yet I was quite struck at the same time that as kind of joyous a modern creation, as you said, rather than recreation, but as joyous a modern creation as Upeliar is, on Shetland I'm so wary of saying any of these names out loud. Underhole? I'm not quite
mhm.
sure how to pronounce that. There is an archaeological dig where they've found two Norse longhouses and do have a full-size replica of a ship found in a burial mound in Norway, the Skid
Yeah, the
Lab mound.
Gorks. Yes, exactly. I think it's a replica of the Gorkstad ship.
Yes, correct.
And yeah, so if you've been to Norway, one of the or to Oslo, one of the best places to visit, which is unfortunately closed at the moment, but is supposed to be opening next year, is the Viking Ship Museum,
Right.
where they have the actual remains of three Viking age ships found in various areas not too far from Oslo, and it's again it's amazing to see what they have been able to preserve. These are actually, preserved. They were in a particular, again, I'm not a geologist, but in a particular kind of wood that really preserved them in very, very good form. The Gorkstad one, yeah. So it's a recreation of that. I think it was
Mhm.
built to sail to America at some point to show that, yes, the Vikings could have done that. Yeah, so that was
But again, around that same point in time, I think I just saw that it was 1880 that they built the replica on Shetland. So still that kind of 19th century interest in their Norse roots. Do you see any kind of modern political, we talk a lot about, I don't know, the Catalonians, for example, in Barcelona, or in Italy, there's often rumblings in northern Italy about seceding. Do you see that ever becoming a part of a political identity for Orkney or Shetland, or is it a different kind of interest that animates this?
I'm not a politician. It's not something that that I think has ever become a particular. I don't think it's really remotely regarded as a possibility. I mean, the islands belonged to Norway for a long period of time, and they were kind of pawned to Scotland when they couldn't afford to pay off their debts, and the idea was never to relinquish them, but unfortunately they never got them back.
They didn't get them back.
No. um, and I mean, yes, I think, depending on who you talk to, you will get some kind of idealists who sort of say, no, we never belonged to Scotland. We were never formally, handed over to Scotland. They've never had any particular,
Mm.
any real right to us. But I don't think there's any real movement to secede and, establish them in their own right or to return them to Norway, because it's just, I, I don't think it's regarded as financially feasible. Yeah. So, I wouldn't like to answer that, because I think you'd need to ask an Orkney Islander or a Shetlander really what their take on that is. But it's not something that you see to the same extent as you might in other places. Yeah.
It does seem that that layered identity, which is in your itinerary in the sense of the historical layers of sites that you visit, that seems particularly unique that in this reasonably small and far-flung set of islands, there are these extraordinary historical layers that aren't even separate layers, because you've also talked about Maeshowe, where Norse people are interacting directly with the Neolithic site by
Hmm.
scratching their inscriptions into the site. Is that the thing that keeps you going back, that keeps you interested in the islands, or is it your specialization and the richness of the runic inscriptions that can be found there?
I mean, it's not. I'm interested in them from a Norse perspective, in all honesty. So, that's what aroused my interest in these islands. That's why I became aware of them in the first place, because they're not places that are on everyone's hit list. But once I think, what I didn't understand perhaps the first time I visited these places is that, yeah, they're not just Norse islands. So yes, like there's a huge, long history dating back that was never obliterated, and so you've got, all kinds, yeah, you have got all kinds of layers making up what it is today, which is perhaps why I don't really sense any kind of movement because
Mm.
towards, establishing it, because
Yeah.
it's more a, what it is.
Yeah.
It's a kind of landscape that's built up over centuries and centuries and centuries. And where they are now is a kind of, conglomerate of prehistoric and Celtic and Norse and Scottish and, all contributing to greater or lesser extent. And people's identities are different to greater or lesser extent. So some feel more,
Mm.
Norse heritage. There's a lot of people, who come up from Scotland for the weekend, and so there's also, now a much stronger Scottish feeling than what there perhaps used to be. Um, so I think, yeah, that's sort of different
Mm.
cultural layers all blending together. And I mean, these are small places too. So, um, and there's a lot of room for individuality and, people expressing their own identity in different ways too. So, yeah, I think,
Yeah, and
um,
galvanizing a community, as you said with Upeliar, that maybe in a smaller place you can make that kind of, you can bring that vision to life and bring the community
yeah,
together every year or every however many years it is that they do that, in order to work on this one kind of project that represents what you value as a community. It
yeah.
as you know, I'm desperately jealous of the itinerary. I would really, really love to join you on the islands, because that combination of extraordinary natural beauty and then a complex, many-layered history,
Yeah.
but also, as you've said, a kind of a vibrant modern life with, a good beer down
Yeah.
the pub.
Because I think you mustn't forget that people live there, and
Yeah.
so it's not just a historical site that you're visiting. It's also yeah, it is all of these are vibrant, active communities full of really interesting people that are carving out lives in ways that are very different to what you might experience in Australia. So yeah, they're interesting places to visit. You can't, you can't not find something of interest in these kind of places. Yeah.
Mm. Excellent.
Mm.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us to open a window on them, particularly onto the Norse sites, which are squarely in your area of expertise. It sounds like it'll be a fabulous journey. And yeah, thank you so much for coming
I'm
along.
really looking forward to leading this tour. I think it would be my privilege to be able to visit these sites with people that are interested in the history and want to learn about them. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yep.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mindy, and thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at the next session. Thanks, Mindy.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.